Welcome back, everyone, to the University of New Mexico Law and Mental Health series. This is weekly discussions of practice and science by experts in behavioral health and the law, hosted by the University of New Mexico Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences, along with the New Mexico Behavioral Health Services Division. We're so thankful to have all of you joining us here today and hope that you had a restful holiday season. I'm Anthony Perillo, the Forensic Psychology Training Director in the Division of Forensic Behavioral Sciences here at the University of New Mexico. For our talk today, if you have any questions for our presenter, make sure you enter them in the Q&A box, and you can do that anytime you feel comfortable throughout the presentation. But just know that we do hold those until the end. We do try to get to as many as we can. It's not always possible to get to all the questions, though. If you are pursuing continuing medical education credits, there will be a sign-in sheet in the chat box shortly. If you're pursuing APA continuing education credits, you will also keep an eye on the chat box, but in the latter portions of the presentation, a link will be posted. Make sure you open that link before you leave here, one, to make sure it's working for you, and two, you won't have access to it after the fact. Also, make sure you save your certificate after you complete the survey because we don't have access to those CE surveys after the fact. A recording link and PowerPoint slides for this talk will be available sometime later this week. And as a heads up for next week's talk in the series, we'll have Dr. Micah Helmus, who's discussing some hot off the presses results of her work looking at risk of repeated perpetration of domestic violence. But let's get back to this week. I'm thrilled to introduce you to today's speaker, who will be ringing in our 2024 year of the didactic topics, discussing issues related to autism spectrum symptoms and disorders and as they pertain to competency evaluations. This is Dr. Kaisa Marshall. Dr. Kaisa Marshall is a licensed psychologist and recently joined us at University of New Mexico as a research assistant professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences in our Division of Forensic Behavioral Sciences. Her forensic evaluations have focused on issues related to competency to stand trial, mitigation, amenability to treatment, violence and sexual risk, and sanity evaluations. She currently conducts competency to stand trial evaluations across the lifespan and pre-employment screens for the Albuquerque Police Department applicants. She has a long-standing interest in working with justice-involved youth, understanding youth developmental psychopathology, and accurate assessment of trauma symptoms in justice-involved individuals. She is devoted to educating others about conducting juvenile forensic evaluations with the overall aim of addressing the lack of available resources for completing these evaluations, particularly in the state of New Mexico. Dr. Marshall, Kaisa, on behalf of us, the University of New Mexico, thank you very much for joining this series. I'm excited to have you sharing your expertise in addition to just thrilling you joining the UNM team. I will go ahead and turn it over to you.
All right, thank you so much. I am happy to be here, happy to be a part of the team, and happy to present on a topic that has been kind of like nagging me for a long time, so I'm excited to have this opportunity to talk about it. I will go ahead and share my screen. Okay. And okay, so as Anthony mentioned, Dr. Pearl mentioned, I'm going to be talking a little bit about autism spectrum disorders and symptoms and how to take those things into consideration when we're doing adult competency to stand trial evaluations. So just some of the basics. This is information about CEs, what you need to do. Disclosure, I don't have any financial arrangements that I need to disclose. The typical disclaimer. And getting into kind of what we're going to be doing today, what I hope this presentation accomplishes, describe the existing gaps in the literature related to adults with autism spectrum disorders in the criminal justice system broadly, explain how criminal or clinical symptoms and presentations of autism can impact competency-related abilities, and then apply an evidence-based evaluation approach and decision-making when conducting competency evaluations where autism symptoms are relevant. And so before I get into any of the real content here, I want to add the, I guess, disclaimer that I'm going to generally refer to autism spectrum disorder, individuals who are experiencing autism spectrum symptoms, just as ASD. I don't advocate for, reducing somebody to their diagnosis, but just for the sake of time and not having to say a mouthful of words each time, I'm just going to refer to it as ASD. So when we talk about autism spectrum disorder, it is a complex neurodevelopmental disorder. And we used to think about this as two separate disorders. We used to say that somebody either has autism or they have Asperger's. And more recently, we've been thinking about it as on a spectrum instead, where there's wide variation in the presentation of those symptoms that go across the spectrum. And although that is still broadly true, a lot of times what has gotten me interested in this topic and thinking about it as it relates to competency and in the legal setting is our discussion about autism oftentimes can be pretty academic, and we tend to think about it in oftentimes psychologists, legal professionals, whoever, tend to think about those more like classic traditional examples, things like not making eye contact, sensitivity to certain textures, things like that. And so we end up broadly characterizing these deficits, or I would advocate for saying differences in communication and social interaction, the hypo and hypersensitivity, and repetitive behaviors, interests, and activities, or restricted interests. And while all those things may be true, if that's all we're looking at, and that's what we are generally looking for if we are assessing for ASD, then we're actually going to end up missing a large chunk of people. So you are capturing some people, but there are so many other variations in this presentation, and not a single person with ASD looks the same as the next person with ASD. And so this doesn't, although they can be part of these kind of categories, that doesn't account for, maybe there are differences in the volume of their speech, difficulties with understanding how things are connected, difficulties with abstraction, translating what they learn in one setting into another. So I think this graphic is really helpful in showing that we used to think about this as the spectrum, but instead it can be more helpful to think about symptoms and the different domains on this wheel. And each of these different domains, things like social awareness, information processing, somebody with ASD is at varying levels or have varying differences in each of these domains. And so with all of these different domains, you can imagine how many different types of ways that this can manifest or present in somebody. So there may be an individual who exhibits arm flapping. They're verbal and sometimes they miss social cues, versus the next person who is fidgety and they struggle with sensory processing, things like being sensitive to bright lights or loud noises. And those two individuals may look vastly different. And so what I will continue to kind of emphasize throughout this presentation is that if we just reduce it to kind of those academic ways of talking about symptoms that we have in the DSM or that we learn sometimes, we will likely end up missing a lot of the nuances, especially when we're talking about adults and maybe somebody who doesn't have a prior diagnosis. So what about in forensic settings? So just to give you some quick, some prevalence rates, some statistics. The estimates right now are that about just over 2% of adults have an ASD diagnosis. And in general, we've been seeing, rates of autism diagnoses increasing. So typically that occurs when somebody is in childhood. The diagnoses in 2000 went from 1 in 250 children had a diagnosis to 1 in 44 in 2018. And right now the rates are 1 in 36 children receive an autism diagnosis. So in general, this is probably because there's been we're getting better at understanding it. Obviously, you know, our diagnostic criteria has changed. There's been increased awareness, outreach, just general research on this topic. But historically, we haven't thought about this a lot in forensic settings. And we typically don't think about individuals coming in contact with the justice system, except for, you know, we see them more often as the ones being victimized. That's how we've traditionally thought about people with ASD in the context of forensic settings. But there is this, you know, in case law, in recent research, just anecdotal experience, we're seeing a growing involvement of individuals with ASD as actual defendants in the criminal legal system. And this starts to raise concerns about their legal status and how we are appropriately responding to individuals when they come in contact with the justice system. So if we think about, you know, what we're asking somebody to do when they go into court, if understanding social conventions, understanding connectedness and how things are connected are difficult for individuals, or if they just generally experience and process information differently, those are all things that are inherently being asked of you in the justice, like as you're going through a case, as you're going through your legal proceedings. And so there may be this need to really think about how unique this population is when they are going through their case and how we're managing that. In general, too, there's also been, you know, if you are on any kind of social media, there's been a lot more focus, and neurodivergence and neurodiversity right now is kind of a hot topic, but there's also been a lot of negative media about ASD in the context, particularly with violence and mass shootings. We think about Sandy Hook and Adam Lanza, and how a lot of people focused on his diagnosis, and that has led to a lot of misunderstandings and misconceptions that continue to infiltrate not only the public, but people, legal professionals, anybody working in the justice system. So just briefly, I want to go over some of the ways that symptoms, just have ASD symptoms in general, could lead to a higher risk of contact with the justice system, because competency to stand trial evaluations don't happen in a vacuum. So it's helpful to understand what is more likely to prompt somebody having contact with the justice system, or situations that may lead to other people misunderstanding their behaviors, why an attorney might refer them, or why, you know, a judge could raise concerns about somebody's competency in this context. So we can think about this in offending behaviors and courtroom behaviors. So as far as offending behaviors, if we look at the literature, and so before we get into this content specifically, the term high functioning autism here is used, and it's used because that was the language taken from the research study of the literature. And I would just like to caution against using that phrasing, because it can be misleading and offensive in the way that high functioning somehow you're kind of like labeling somebody's diagnosis, the severity of their diagnosis. And it may be that they can function well in certain domains, but have differences in other domains. So they just want to caution against that. But for that reason, that term is in here, because I think that's how a lot of times it's used in a colloquial sense, even sometimes obviously a scientific sense as well. But what we're really referring to here is an individual with an autism diagnosis who doesn't also have an accompanying intellectual deficit. And so those individuals are more likely to offend than individuals who have ASD and an intellectual deficit. And what can be difficult is that then the symptoms are less obvious. You may be less likely to pick up that that's what's going on with somebody, or that has anything to do with their offending behavior. We also used to think, like the field generally used to think that certain offenses were more likely to be committed by somebody with ASD, things like arson, sexual assault, things like that. But as we have gathered more data, we have more research, the literature shows that those findings are pretty inconsistent. And so instead of thinking about certain criminal charges or certain offenses being more likely to be committed by somebody with ASD, there are distinctive behaviors that might be more likely to result in legal charges for somebody than an actual category of the offense. So anything related to differences in showing and reading social cues, emotions, personal space, and theory of mind deficits, understanding what other people are thinking and feeling, and that might be different from your own thoughts and feelings. So think about, somebody misinterpreting a social relationship, things like, stalking or something like that, or misunderstanding a friendship and in the guise of being a good friend, they aid in stealing, or like they keep the stolen property for their quote unquote friends who are actually just using them, taking advantage of them, and them not understanding that social nuance. Things like poor impulse and motor control can be easy to understand how that might lead to criminal charges. And then fixation on interests and routine, or like restricted interest. So a good example of this is a defendant who found that the noise and watching a washing machine was soothing for them. And so when they would become anxious or distressed, they got into a routine of just turning the washing machine on, and that would help. It's kind of a self-soothing behavior. And then one day their washing machine broke. And so they went to their neighbor's house and turned on their washing machine. And they were just sitting there, trying to calm down, when obviously law enforcement was called. And in the process of trying to remove that person from the house, they became incredibly upset that their routine was being disrupted, their skill for calming down was being disrupted, and they were flailing their arms and they hit one of the arresting officers, and then eventually were charged with trespassing and battery on a peace officer. As far as what might come up in a courtroom that might lead to a referral for competency, or a misunderstanding of somebody's behaviors, is just differences in social and communication differences. So, oftentimes individuals with ASD learn social behaviors and learn what is expected of them in social settings. And so they may demonstrate inappropriate social behavior that they learned was appropriate in a different setting. So if you have been taught that when you meet somebody new and they're talking to you, you smile at them, it may be misunderstood when, maybe they're in an arraignment and a judge is reading, their charges to them and explaining what they did wrong, what they're being accused of, and the defendant is smiling back at them. That may be something that is not understood or misconstrued. As far as language differences, it could present as somebody using overly formal language, or crude, inappropriate language, just generally idiosyncratic communication style. And this is more likely to happen when somebody is anxious or overstimulated. So if you think suddenly you're in a new setting, you've never been in a courtroom before, you've never had to deal with all these people, answer questions, or track this kind of information, of course you're more likely to be anxious, and there's a lot of sensory stimuli going on. Also, echolalia, so that is repeating words or phrases that were said. So if a judge, says something to a defendant and all of a sudden that defendant is just repeating back that same phrase over and over again, it could, obviously people will be thrown off, they'll be concerned about that individual, but it may also be interpreted as if the defendant is mocking the judge, or if, that language is then later used at an inappropriate time, how that could raise some alarm. And then it may also be, an issue of delayed response times. So as I was saying, there's a lot going on in a courtroom, a lot going on that you have to understand in legal proceedings. And individuals with ASD already have difficulty processing information in the same way that other people would process information, but also filtering out relevant and irrelevant information. So if all of that's coming in at once, trying to make sense of this new environment that you're in, all these new people that are surrounding you that you don't understand what they're doing and have some expectation of you, and they're using legal jargon and words that you don't understand what's happening. It may be very difficult. It's difficult for anybody to kind of navigate that situation. But then if you have these differences in processing on top of that, it may take a lot longer to have all that information come in, process it, and then provide a response, if at all. And so that might be something that either in the courtroom or in conversations with attorney kind of like raises this alarm or raises this concern that competency should be brought up. So as I've alluded to a little bit, we don't have a ton of literature and empirical data to rely on when it comes to what is our understanding of how ASD is understood in court settings, how it's understood as it relates to competency. And so when we look at, what do decision makers, what is their understanding of how this information should be used? What we know is there's just very limited research about the forensic relevance of ASD related features and also how they're considered by decision makers and judges. And when judges are surveyed about this topic, there is, they express a limited understanding of the nuances and forensic relevance of the symptoms. They generally lack confidence in their knowledge about autism. And even when they know that autism is relevant for a defendant or it's, applicable in a case, they're unsure how it should be considered in various stages of legal proceedings, and that includes competency. But on a more positive note, what we do know is that education about ASD and symptomology is really beneficial for decision makers and legal professionals. And so when that education is provided, when there's more of an understanding around not just the label of what autism is, but what those symptoms are, how they can manifest, how they can impact an individual in court proceedings, judges feel much more confident about how to use that information and make decisions in the relevance of that data. And so I will talk about this later, but it highlights the importance of the role of, if you are a forensic evaluator, completing competency evaluations, the importance of providing education to the court, providing, this knowledge to the court. Unfortunately, we have even less information as it relates to attorneys' knowledge and awareness of autism. When a recent meta-analysis was going through all of this and literature review, they found one study specifically looking at attorneys and their awareness and knowledge about autism. And so we have very limited empirical data, but when attorneys were surveyed, they did express concern about kind of the lack of supports that are provided by the courts, and that adjustments and modifications would be helpful if they could be provided. So things like allowing for breaks and extra time, making language and communication modifications to assist their clients in understanding the jargon and nuanced court procedures that they're having to navigate and understand. So there already is some recognition by attorneys that making modifications would be okay, and that if they're feasible from a court's perspective, they would like that to happen. Also, as just kind of like an interesting aside, there were some differences in attorneys and versus like their clients' perceptions of how well attorneys did navigating or assisting their client in navigating this the legal setting when they have ASD. And so attorneys thought that they did a lot better than clients thought they did in assisting them, understanding what they needed, and kind of helping them work through the court proceedings. So I wholly believe that that is not limited to just attorneys. I think in general, this highlights this idea that like even when we think we know, or we think we're doing a decent job, we think we know what we're working with, we probably need to be a lot more informed and asking the individual, checking in a lot more. So I think we might know a little bit more than we actually do. So what about when we actually get into these pre-trial settings, things like competency? As I mentioned earlier, we are generally seeing an increase in defendants with ASD. And although I couldn't find any specific numbers, mostly, this is related to difficulties with reliable data. Recent, articles, recent case law, just anecdotal experience suggests that this is becoming a consideration more and more. And in general, there's a lack of research as it relates to how to approach evaluations when you are considering ASD, especially in adults, and competency. And, a few recent textbooks have actually come out saying, like, we really need to be focusing on this more. We don't know as much as we would like. And there's a lot of concerns about maybe what we're missing here. And one of the reasons that this might be such a kind of a lacking area is that there's limited professionals trained in both of these areas. So, usually the people who are most qualified, who have the most experience with assessing autism, identifying autism, end up going into more of a school setting role rather than a legal role. And because we haven't traditionally thought about ASD coming up that much in legal settings, it's generally just kind of like a superficial understanding, or somebody has a really good legal, like forensic psychologist understanding. And then other people over here have a really good understanding of autism and how to diagnose and assess for it. And so we need to kind of start bridging this gap between those two lines of expertise. So as far as if we actually look at, what we do know in the literature about competency and considering taking ASD considerations when completing these evaluations. So individuals with autism can present as more competent than they actually are. And I will kind of touch on that in a little bit as far as why that might be and how that can happen. But what the literature also tells us is those individuals, participants who are diagnosed with autism, have more difficulty understanding and following various aspects of the courtroom. That extends to difficulties with understanding personnel roles, understanding the process. We don't see as many differences between more concrete ideas, things like discussing evidence, as it relates to ASD, but those things that require you to put a lot of pieces together, understand the nuances, understand the connections, that's where somebody with ASD may have more difficulties than somebody without a diagnosis in going through legal proceedings. And a lot of this comes down to differences in theory of mind. So again, being able to understand somebody else's emotions, their thoughts related to their emotions, and that those are different from what you yourself are experiencing can be important. This can be one of the more important things that comes up for competency to stand trial evaluations. And I already mentioned we have limited professionals with adequate training in these areas, both of these areas. And this is all complicated and further limited by the fact that a lot of the data that we do have is focused on white Eurocentric males. And so although there could be a whole presentation on how autism may look different in women or other populations, we just don't know as much about it. And so as far as in the literature, as it relates to competency, but I just will briefly go over this because, like I said, this could be a whole presentation in and of itself. But generally, we are not as good at detecting this in women and girls, even though there's some research to suggest that it may be more prevalent. Autism may be more prevalent in girls than boys, actually. And one of the reasons that this may be true is because a lot of times women and girls experience more of the restricted interest or the sensory sensitivities rather than the social communication differences. And so they're better able to mask those things that would alert people to the fact that they are, that's what's going on with this individual, that they have differences, these kind of differences. As far as what this looks like in Black, Indigenous, and people of color, in general, we are not as good at detecting it in these populations. We kind of lack awareness broadly. We are not only more likely to miss these diagnoses altogether, children, Indigenous children, Latino children, Black children are all more likely to be diagnosed later on in life than white children. And in particular, in addition to like missing the diagnoses, we're also more likely to misdiagnose the symptoms that we're seeing. So Black American children are 5 times more likely to be misdiagnosed with a conduct or adjustment disorder rather than somebody picking up that is, something like autism or ADHD, some kind of like neurodivergent symptoms. And so that has a lot of bearing on and adds an additional challenge to forensic settings and evaluations because a lot of times people's behaviors are misinterpreted as something that's completely different. And so it may be that you're seeing an adult who never had an autism diagnosis because either it was missed altogether or it was misunderstood as something different. And so you don't have that insight going into an evaluation that this is what's going on with somebody. And so before we get into breaking down the specific symptoms and how they impact competency-related abilities, I just kind of want to focus on what this means for adults in particular, and kind of how unique this population can be. So of course, autism is something that is going to come up in both youth and adult competency to stand trial evaluations, and it's more commonly seen in youth evaluations. But there are also, it's also easier to pick up on in youth because there are other probably things going on with the kid, other developmental issues, either just like age, other developmental delays that you might notice in a kid, or if somebody has already detected those things in a kid, then they may already be more likely to have a diagnosis. So whereas if you're seeing somebody as an adult who's never had a diagnosis, it may be harder to know that that's what's going on and pick up on some of those nuances. Also, if somebody doesn't have any comorbidities, they don't have the accompanying intellectual deficits that make it easier to pick up or clue into the idea that somebody's struggling with competency. And so what it leaves us with is this population, this unfortunate term of a high-functioning adult with autism. And, this colloquial term to refer to individuals that otherwise may present as pretty neurotypical. They're less likely to have a diagnosis, and so their behavior and their symptoms are more likely to be misinterpreted and then lead them to have contact with the system. And so it actually is a really unique population I think often gets missed, which is kind of what spurred this whole idea of talking about this. And so as I've, alluded to, oftentimes individuals are not, they don't have a previous diagnosis. And so it can be difficult to initially recognize. It may be that this has been missed their whole life. And that could be barriers to even just disclosing the diagnosis. So because of the misconceptions, because of the myths and negative stereotypes that have been associated with autism, a defendant may know that they have that diagnosis and they don't want to tell you. It may be, just because we have gotten better at diagnosing this as time has gone on, that when this person was a child, it was missed because we weren't as aware, we weren't as knowledgeable about this, or they were living in an area where they didn't have access to those resources. We still continue to not have enough providers, not have enough qualified providers. And so it's not unreasonable to think that somebody grew up in an area where they weren't flagged, nobody picked up on this, and they weren't in an area even where they could get an assessment, even if it was. There's also these ideas of scripting and masking. And so this can also kind of blur the lines or make it more difficult to detect some of these symptoms. So scripting is this idea that, people learn certain ways to behave in social settings. When it's not intuitive to them, they have learned, okay, and this is what is expected of me in this social setting. I introduce myself, I say hello. And so they have learned in how society expects them to behave in social settings. And so it may not be that there's any like differences that you notice in brief interactions until perhaps somebody is, really distressed or fatigued. Then it may be that, you start picking up on some of those differences. There's also this idea of masking, which is, it was explained as going through life trying to conform to societal rules and expectations. And the analogy that was given is everybody in the world is playing a game. And everybody else seems to understand the rules of the game, but somebody with autism doesn't understand those rules. And they don't understand why they don't understand those rules. And there's no manual to help them understand. And so they just have to try to pick up what they can and act the way that they are seeing other people act, even when they don't fully understand what's going on or the rules that they're expected to abide by. So, just kind of a rhetorical question. What are some things that might clue you in to consider that that you might want to consider autism? Like if you're meeting with somebody, what are some other things that would put you on alert that this is something that you need to be thinking about? So there are a lot of ways that autism can present and have overlap with other disorders and clusters of symptoms. And so if at any point you're considering these types of disorders, you should also be considering autism. Again, could spend a whole lecture on how autism can look like a lot of other diagnoses, but in particular, these are some of the ones that if this is coming up for you, you're starting to suspect this, or somebody has these past diagnoses, in the back of your mind, you should also just be either attending to or ruling out autism. So, a lot of times, especially in boys, some of those antisocial traits or like disruptive behaviors, struggling with expressing emotions, understanding emotions can be autism, or it can be interpreted as like a conduct disorder. Difficulties with social interactions, not wanting to have those social interactions. And I think it was pretty recently that I saw, an email chain where something very similar came up, where somebody was struggling to conceptualize what was going on with somebody in a competency evaluation. It was just like there was a kind of a lack of future orientation. They just weren't getting it. They didn't seem to understand, the seriousness of their legal situation, seriousness of the consequences, and all of these other diagnoses, all of these other hypotheses were suggested. And it wasn't until much later that anybody suggested that autism should be ruled out. And I think partially because that's just not something that we are regularly considering or have historically considered in competency to stand trial evaluations. And I guess my plug here is that we should be a lot more, because there's so much overlap with some of these other symptoms and ways that it could interfere with somebody's competency-related abilities. So we'll get into more of those specifics now. So just in general, some broad ways that ASD symptoms and symptomology could impact somebody's competency-related abilities. So if we think about these difficulties in navigating unfamiliar situations and environments. So somebody with ASD may function well in certain contexts when they're comfortable in familiar settings, and all of a sudden you throw them in a unfamiliar setting, and it can lead to erratic conduct, poor judgment, and generally their ability to understand and appreciate the repercussions of their actions can become limited. There may be this propensity to panic and behave impulsively and unpredictably. And so, an example here is, this was actually in a treatment setting, but there was an individual who had learned, is soothing. It was kind of like their coping skill. It was a way to regulate their distress, was to make animal noises. Grew up on a farm around a lot of animals, and that was kind of what they associated with something familiar to calm themselves down. And in working with them, they got a lot better at finding other ways that society deemed more acceptable to manage their stress and their anxiety. But in new settings, when somebody new was, in the room, or this person became uncomfortable or distressed, would revert back to making those animal noises. And so you can imagine that would not be something that would be looked upon favorably, or go over well in a courtroom. And so in general, there may just be these idiosyncratic behaviors and reactions that get misunderstood by people. And just not understanding the social nuances or what is expected of them in that situation. So, having a conversation with their attorney, and suddenly they just get up and leave and walk out of the room without announcing it, not realizing that that's not something that you can do, kind of like the seriousness of a meeting with an attorney and why that would be inappropriate in that moment. And in general, a lot of this boils down to individuals with ASD experience the world in a way that is different from those without ASD. But the court system and society has been set up in a very specific way with certain social conventions, certain social norms that may differ greatly from how somebody else understands the world, or is in direct conflict with how somebody understands the world. There's also just difficulty generalizing learning from one situation to another, and dealing with tasks that are open-ended or don't have clear rules. So if you've never been in a courtroom, suddenly you're expected to know how to behave in court and what is expected of you in court, when to talk, when not to talk, how you're supposed to be showing emotions, and that is not necessarily intuitive for everybody. So those are just kind of like some broad ways that this might impact competency-related abilities. I mean, if you get down to the core of differences in like understanding the world, differences in information processing, difficulty understanding social nuances and social interactions and social emotional reciprocity, and then also just how things are connected, just this general idea of connectedness. Those are all things that inherently would impact your ability, your competency-related abilities, depending on how they might manifest. And so there's just kind of some core things that why this might be relevant, why autism spectrum symptoms might be relevant to competency. But we'll go through now like the specific prongs of competency and how each of them can be impacted by ASD symptomology. And so I'm going to try to focus on using examples here because I think that is, the easiest way to understand some of these things, especially because, as I mentioned earlier, I think a lot of times this becomes a very academic conversation. Like, okay, so a literal and rigid cognitive style might impact somebody's factual and rational understanding. Well, what does it actually look like in a competency evaluation? So for instance, there's an individual who he was detained, and he had been detained for a little bit, and several other inmates had been telling him, you could face the death penalty. Like that's the worst thing that could happen to you. You better be careful. Kind of trying to intimidate and scare him. And so when I met with him, he was under the impression that he could face the death penalty. That was like the maximum charge. So when I informed him, actually, the death penalty doesn't exist in New Mexico, his response was, oh, well, if I can't get, the death penalty, then I have nothing to worry about. Like, this isn't a big deal. And so kind of that rigid cognitive style, difficulty with understanding there's a lot of other ways that this could impact you, and actually it's still pretty serious. Just because you can't get the death penalty doesn't mean this charge isn't serious. That said, in general, this domain, this prong is probably the area that is going to be least likely to be impacted by ASD symptoms, because a lot of it can focus on just semantic memory, just like learning terms, learning, roles of people, things like that. And oftentimes semantic memory can be a strength for an individual with ASD, whereas like episodic memory or asking them about autobiographical memories can be more challenging, understanding what they were thinking and feeling at the time of the charges. This idea of lack of central cohesion can also be impairing in the idea that there are a lot of different component parts of a court proceeding, and that they are all connected, so that you, because this one thing happened, that's connected to this other thing, that's connected to this other thing, and it may depend how that goes each time. And trying to understand not just this one specific role, like the role of a defense attorney, but how that connects with the prosecutor and the adversarial system and what that means, and putting it all together and understanding the whole picture can be difficult. Also, just general difficulties with metaphors and hypotheticals. So usually if somebody is not, is having difficulty talking about their charges as it relates to them specifically, a lot of times the approach is, okay, well, we'll use a metaphor to help you understand this, or we'll use a hypothetical to see if you have the capacity to reason through these legal situations. But those types of scenarios, that type of communication can be particularly difficult for an individual with ASD to understand, because it involves a lot of abstraction. It involves some like intuitively understanding that we're not talking about them specifically. And so that can become even more complicating. So when we look at somebody's like ability to consult with their attorney with a reasonable degree of rational understanding, so this could be things like poor boundaries, providing irrelevant, like tons and tons of irrelevant information, leaving the room without announcing it, just getting up. I have to go to the bathroom, so of course I'm going to go to the bathroom. Another, or like providing somebody with all, like not only they ask for their name, okay, here's my name, here's my date of birth, here's my address, and having difficulty getting them back on track. So difficulties understanding and following social conventions, may not understand that laying down on the ground while talking to your attorney might communicate that they are not interested, or they're not appreciating the seriousness of the conversation, whereas in their mind, they're like, well, I'm just more comfortable down here. I'm still engaged, and not understanding why that might be a difficult, or be misunderstood. Also, this idea of like perseverating, having perseverative cognitions or speech. So, for instance, the legal definition, understanding the legal definition of assault and the colloquial term of assault. And so somebody may be charged with assault, even though they didn't actually hit somebody, let's say they threatened, and they can't understand or learn that the legal term of assault is different than like kind of the colloquial terms. It's like trying to explain to them their charges, why they're being charged with what they are, and they just continue to say, but I didn't hit them, but I didn't hit them, none of this should matter, I didn't hit them. And having difficulty understanding that there is a difference between your existing understanding of assault and how the court is using the term assault. This could also be difficulty with sensory sensitivity. So if somebody is overstimulated, either the bright lights bother them, the loud noises, like if you're in a jail setting. And while most people can articulate their distress in response to some kind of sensory hypersensitivity, it depends on the situation. They may become so overwhelmed that they either have a meltdown, or just completely shut down. So that could be, suddenly there's this outburst, and that can be misinterpreted, or would be really problematic if suddenly that happened in court. Or they could just shut down and not respond, become nonverbal, and then that would, impair your ability to continue with the evaluation. This idea of echolalia that I talked about earlier, somebody may repeat phrases and words without understanding what they're saying, and just they had heard it before, so now they're just repeating it. In a sense, it can be a strategy of self-soothing, but it could also indicate to somebody that they are understanding something when they really don't. Again, these difficulties with understanding sarcasm and implied meaning, and a lot of times there's a lot of things that just are implied in court proceedings, and they're not well spelled out. And then just a disruption to your routine. So if, somebody's out of custody and then suddenly they're asked to come in, and that transition, difficulty with change, difficulty with transitioning into going to court could result in a meltdown, could result in an outburst, and how that might impair their ability to act appropriately in court. Or sit down in a room with an attorney and have a reasonable conversation. Then this idea of this last prong, capacity to assist in one's own defense. So as I mentioned earlier, difficulties with autobiographical and episodic memory. So individuals may not be readily self-monitoring. So they may not have even known how they were feeling at the time of the charges. They may make limited references to mental states. And if you're asking them about this, they may not understand why. why you're asking them that. And then difficulty making connections and pieces of information. So think about how many things you have to explain to somebody in understanding a plea deal, how many different contingencies and how to put that whole process together with a plea deal. And somebody may be focusing on just one specific piece of the plea deal and not be able to understand that it's this entire agreement that is contingent on these different things. Again, going back to this idea of being really focused on the fact that I didn't commit assault because I didn't hit somebody, rather than being able to then talk about a reasonable defense strategy, such as a plea deal, because they're so convinced that that this is an inappropriate charge. It doesn't make any sense. Also, theory of mind, I've mentioned this a few times, but difficulties with theory of mind. So, and like this black and white rigid thinking, if, an individual with ASD is pretty rigid in their thought process and they know that they did something wrong, like they are like, yeah, I did it, so I have to plead guilty. Like I can't possibly plead not guilty. I can't do anything else because I did it, and therefore the judge knows I did it because I know I did it and I have to plead guilty. And getting stuck in that rigid way of thinking and not being able to understand that they have other options. Or if they're focused on, right versus wrong. Well, I was doing the right thing, even though it ended up in legal charges, thinking that they are not open to punishment or don't understand why they're being punished or could be punished because, well, but I was doing the right thing. There was another example I was just focusing, telling the truth, but I have to tell the truth. And while you would never suggest that somebody shouldn't tell the truth, there may be times when you don't want to tell, the truth, or you don't want to go tell the truth to the prosecutor without your attorney present, just not being able to abstract the idea that there are times when you don't tell the truth or you just don't say anything, rather than if they ask me this, of course I have to tell them, I have to tell the truth. So in New Mexico, we have this other additional prong, this other thing that we have to consider in our evaluations, and it relates to competency in general. Just can they comprehend reasons for punishment? And I thought that this quote was really helpful and indicative. It was a good example of how this can come up. So this quote is by an individual, Nick Dubin, who was arrested and charged with possession of child sex abuse material. And eventually he went on to get his clinical psychology degree and wrote a book about his experiences. He also has an autism diagnosis, and in conjunction with some other professionals, wrote about his experience. And so he has a really unique perspective that I think highlights this well. So he said, at the time, I didn't understand that downloading free images on my computer in the privacy of my residence could lead to the severe legal charges I later experienced. I also didn't understand at the time that the children in the images had been victimized in the process of creating those images. I honestly had no idea that I was causing harm to anyone. It is very embarrassing to admit that I needed to have this information spelled out for me, as I wasn't able to make that connection on my own. After my arrest, my psychologist spent considerable time explaining the issue of victim awareness to me. I was horrified to learn that these minors had been mistreated and that I had not been able to see that. So
Kaisa, Dr. Marshall, we are at the top of the hour, so I just wanted to make sure that the audience does know that. And thank you for this very thorough discussion here. We do have questions that are continuing to trickle in. I will ask some, but in the meantime, if you wanted to have a final thought there of the content there that you were discussing, then I'll throw a couple of questions at you. We could certainly do that.
Yeah, so sorry, I was looking at the wrong time. Just using all of this information and understanding how it relates, see each person as an individual, their functional abilities, how does this relate to competency, and use this as an opportunity to educate the courts if you're doing a competency evaluation. Really spell it out for them.
Wonderful. And thank you so much, Dr. Marshall Kaisa, for all of that information here. We do have a ton of questions so far. I see a couple of themes that I'll be able to merge some of them. In the meantime, if you have other questions for Kaisa here, feel free to enter them in the chat. I'll get to as many as we can in the next 10 minutes or so. For those of you that are pursuing APA continuing education credits, make sure you check that link. It does work. If it's not working for you right now, make sure you copy the link and save that hyperlink for another time so that you can check other web browsers and all that, so that you can open for your CE credits. I love this particular question here that gets at some of the crux of what you're talking about in terms of competency. They preface by saying, great presentation, Dr. Marshall. It gets at the core of a lot of statutes here. But in terms of competency, how might you attempt to differentiate between someone with ASD who has difficulty with competency-related abilities versus being incapable of those competency abilities?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. Unfortunately, I didn't get to that whole portion of my presentation, but I think what is really important is, so these are all the ways that these competency abilities can be impacted, but testing the limits with somebody. What accommodations can you make to see if somebody can eventually get there? Can you use certain prompts? Can you break it down for somebody even more? What accommodations might be made? Do you need to just ask direct questions? Do you need to give them breaks? Do you need to meet with them a few different times? And so obviously that's dependent on, the setting that you're working in, the time constraints that you might have, but give them every opportunity to, with accommodations, with these different modifications, demonstrate that they have that capacity. So not just asking them once and leaving it, but see, okay, if I ask them this in a different way, if I break it down a little bit more, can they get there? I talk to their attorney and we figure out, are there reasonable ways for us to get through this for them to get through that process?
Wonderful, thank you. So the multiple different ways, avenues that could suggest some difficulty, but nonetheless being able to do it versus like repeatedly hitting a dead end.
Right.
That might more increasingly suggest inability. Several people asked about testing as it might relate to autism spectrum issues and competency evaluations, particularly the ADOS. So trying to merge a couple of questions here. Would it be fair to say using the ADOS is considered a quote unquote gold standard for diagnosing autism? And relatedly, would this administration require specific training?
So the ADOS does require specific training to be able to administer, and from everything I know, it is still considered the gold standard of diagnosing autism. That said, that is probably not feasible in your run-of-the-mill competency evaluations. And so it may be that you suspect autism and this person has never had a diagnosis, but that doesn't mean you have to provide an autism diagnosis, but lay out, even if you're in, a state that requires you to make a diagnosis, it can be an unspecified neurocognitive or neurodevelopmental disorder, but just spell out what the differences that this person's having, the deficits that they're having, and specifically how that relates to their functional competency abilities. I don't think you necessarily have to go in and, administer an ADOS.
Wonderful, thank you for that. Other testing aside, people were asking if there were particular competency-related instruments that you do recommend for individuals with autism spectrum, anything like the EXTER, the CAST-MR. Are there particular tools that you recommend for this particular population?
That's a good question. I don't know that there's anything, if other people have other ideas, then that I feel free to suggest them. But there's nothing that I think, because we are just generally not very good at assessing this in general, I don't think that there's a lot of measures out there that already would get at this. But I think, avoiding hypotheticals, if you can, keeping it very specific to this person would be helpful. And so there are actually some that may not be as helpful if they're more abstract in that sense.
Excellent. Thank you for that. Several people ask questions about autism in competency evaluations and potentially assessing for malingering. And there's actually a flip side to this. So I'll ask you two questions. I'll ask them separately. The first one is more about people that might be malingering autism. Can you just broadly comment on detecting potentially malingered autism spectrum related deficits?
Yeah, I think it would go into just doing general symptom validity testing that you would do. There's nothing, at least that I'm aware of, that specifically detects malingering of autism symptoms, but I'm trying to think of how somebody might. I think it would be the same way that you would detect somebody trying to malinger or exaggerate intellectual deficits. I think because our understanding of what autism is can generally be misconstrued, especially by the public, they're probably going to be attempting to feign other symptoms than actual autism symptoms.
And then the flip side, someone asked if you ever find that individuals with autism spectrum disorder might be suspected of malingering based on attorney or evaluator's misunderstanding of their presentation and not identifying autism-related deficits as a reason for those observed symptoms.
Yes, I have had this come up, and I think what I tried to focus on in that was using as many examples and like really breaking down. I did do symptom validity testing in that to demonstrate that they were putting forth good effort. This really was where they were functioning at. Also spoke to family members to give other examples that this wasn't just in the legal setting that they were having these types of deficits and difficulties. Getting school records and talking to jail personnel, the individuals that were seeing him day in and day out, and just like the adaptive behavior issues, the difficulties transitioning, those kinds of things that would be difficult to feign with somebody watching you all the time, and explaining how that contributed to my understanding of their competency-related abilities and that this was actually what was going on.
Excellent. Thank you for that. Somebody asked, for clients that have very high IQ, but have autism spectrum disorder related difficulties that make them incompetent to stand trial for the time being, what's the best way to explain this discrepancy to the court, or at least what would look like a discrepancy perhaps to people with like a high IQ and nonetheless being not competent because of some sort of developmental issue?
Yeah, I think that's where it can be really, really important to provide additional education in your report. Like, of course, we want to be efficient with what we say, but this is a time when explaining that like somebody's IQ and somebody's developmental abilities are different in this scenario, and saying, while they may be able to do these things and can intellectually, they're at this very high level, here's what they struggle with. Here's the capacities they don't have, and what would happen if they were in court. And just giving examples, breaking it down very specifically, and providing a lot of education. It may be that depending on what setting you're working in, you set up a meeting with the attorney and really try to break it down for them. Because sometimes that can be wordy in a report if you can't do that.
Sure. And then one final question to wrap this up. A couple of people asked about post-competency evaluation, more competency restoration issues. If you have any idea about competency restoration outcomes for people at different levels of impairment with autism spectrum issues.
That's a fantastic question. I actually don't, and I would love to know what we know about that. My guess is not a lot, but that's probably going to be added to my list of things to go look up.
Certainly. Okay. Well, thank you so much, Kaisa, Dr. Marshall, for a very helpful discussion of a particularly unique population that a lot of us come across in our forensic work here. That about wraps up this week's Law and Mental Health series. We hope to see you next week when Dr. Micah Helmus will be discussing recidivism risk for people who have perpetrated domestic violence. We hope you have a fantastic rest of the week and have had a great start to 2024 so far. Until next time, take care.